This now brings us to part 4 of the history of God. When we left off, the belief in the one true God was now being spread by the Greco-Roman Empire, which now again brings us to a new age. Over a fair-sized span of time, the belief in God became the only acceptable belief of civilized people, and thus we enter the time of medieval. At this point in history, many things changed. For the first time, many different nations, kingdoms, and groups all worshiped the same God. Not only that, but belief in this one God was now absolutely required. Failure to do so would get the people and rulers killed by the power of the church, which was a fairly new creation. The church was a centralized place of worship for God, though the church itself was one much like an empire. It was based on a hierarchical system that told individual priests where they sat compared to others, told everyone who the rulers of the church were, and ensured everyone knew their place in God's kingdom. Of course, the church didn't spring into existence overnight. As the belief in the one true God flourished, the priests began to grow more powerful. As the voice of God, they were the only ones who could talk to God, get God to grant favors of any kind or for any reason. Thus, they inevitably created the church. During the height of the church's power, the people were ruled by two rulers, the person who sat on each individual throne and the church leaders of the same area. The people were required to obey both, the church first, of course, and for the first time in history, the people had no real true sense of freedom. You need to understand that every aspect of the people's lives were governed by others. During this time, most could barely support themselves. It became a very hard struggle for the average person to survive, while of course the church and the rulers all became very rich and powerful. However, like always, there were other problems in this new system. The biggest problem was that not everyone believed in God. Other people still held on to older beliefs or had adopted their own ideas of what the one true God was that differed from that which the church decreed it was. And of course, this was unacceptable to the church and thus unacceptable to all. To help remove these non-believers from existence, the church initiated a holy war against them. People from all walks of life flocked to the Holy Land to drive these non-believers out. The people generally only fighting to enrich their holdings, make a name for themselves or whatever, but it was all done with the church's blessing at the end of the day. Now, cultures that had existed for centuries before the church was even created were pegged as heathens, as primitive peoples with backwards beliefs. And for many, many years, this war was waged. Anyone who didn't bow to the will of the church and its holy crusaders were slaughtered. This was a very violent and bloody time. Countless people died on both sides, while the leaders and rulers stayed hidden away well out of danger. Those on the side of the church working to add wealth and power to themselves and the church, of course, but the others were only basically there to defend themselves or their lands. At the end of this time, the peoples back home had become exhausted. There were less and less people willing to fight in their crusades, and so the church eventually had no choice but to stop the war, with no one really being a clear winner. In the end, both sides suffered massively for this war, and no matter how you look at it, no one won. Also, during this time, faith in the church began to wane. The people were demoralized and had had enough of the holy war. The church still, of course, had their power, but it was beginning to be questioned, something that the church simply couldn't stand for. So it began doing things in new ways, by adopting some old ideas. The church began working to reinforce the fear that people had for dark creatures. Before this time, the creatures were seen as outside. The people were afraid of them, but the only risk was being caught unawares and killed by them. And the church began to change that. The church began to tell people that evil spirits could take over their bodies and make them do things. Thus, for the first time in history, the people could be possessed by evil and made to commit evil acts. And in the end, anything the church didn't like or agree with became about evil spirits or demonic possession. The people became so afraid for their very existence that they happily renewed their faith in the church. They gave in to anything the church wanted as long as they made sure to keep these evil spirits and demons away. After all, the people didn't really have a choice. If they refused, then they too would be called evil. And with the church working to instill such tremendous fear into the people is where we'll leave this part. And so we'll continue into part 5. See you there.